Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Leighton Brown, the Master of McLaughlin College. And normally I say on these occasions, welcome to McLaughlin College. But here we are in the Senate chamber. And here we are having struggled with the elevators in the North Tower of the Ross Building. And for those of you with any history at York, you probably know or know the name of William Farr, who was the Vice President, Finance and Administration for many years and a lot of other things before that. One day when he and I were standing at the bottom of those elevators waiting, he told me that back in the 1960s or early 70s, he almost lost his job because of a cost overrun associated with putting in the second elevator in the North Tower. Every time I ride those elevators, I am grateful to Bill Farr for having put in the second elevator. Imagine what it would be like if there were only one. Anyway, welcome to the Senate chamber at York University. This is an event that we had hoped to have on International Women's Day, but circumstances intervened and there was a labor disruption and the event had to be postponed. But I am really glad that we've been able to do it even though it is not on the official day, because not only is our speaker an outstanding one, as you will hear in her introduction and hear for yourselves in a few moments, but the subject is a terrifically important one. And it's really appropriate that it is, I was going to say here at McLaughlin College, but under the auspices of McLaughlin College this is happening, because I trust you all know McLaughlin College is the college at York dedicated to the understanding and critical analysis of public policy. And this is a crucial public policy issue that lives on with us. It's not an easily, finally resolved one. I also want to acknowledge the absolutely invaluable partnership that we have with the School of Public Policy Administration in organizing these series of recognitions of international days. And thank you to James and to all of your colleagues. Some of you will have heard me say this many, many times, but for those students in the room who have not heard me say it before, if you have not signed in at the register at the front of the room, please do. It's not because we are checking up on you. It's because McLaughlin College gives a certificate of participation to every student who attends 6 or more of our lunch talks or public policy speakers in the course of the year. And the only way we know if you've attended 6 or more of them is if you sign in on each occasion that you're here. So please do. Even though this is not a lunchtime talk, it counts as one of the lunch talk series. So I've told you how great an experience you are about to have. I would now like someone else to tell you how great an experience you're about to have. Brenda Spotton-Visano will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Master David. Oh, I've always wanted to say that. It is as much a pleasure as an honor to introduce President Emerita Dr. Lorna Marsden. Many of us here today know her as a long-serving president of York University. In her 10-year tenure as York's 6th president. From 1997 to 2007, she brought the inimitable force of her presence to York, propelling us into the 21st century as a top-ranked university in both academic achievement and physical space. While no short introduction can hope to do justice to the scope and consequence of all her contributions, let me highlight just a few of her extraordinary achievements and recognitions and situate these briefly in what I see as an important context. So I'm going to walk it back to 1912 when women academics were the first to then be appointed as professor at Canadian universities. But it would be another 60 years, so not until the 1970s, before women made inroads into senior academic administration. And it wasn't until the 1970s that we saw the first woman appointed as president of what was then recognized as a major co-educational university in Canada. Here at York, with many firsts, in 1974, Margaret Kniddle became the first woman elected to a senior administrative position in a faculty outside of what was then called domestic sciences. These firsts are happening just as Dr. Marsden is completing her PhD at Princeton in 1972 and commencing her academic career as a professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. Dr. Marsden enters academe in what might be viewed as a second wave of women's academic and professional achievement in Canada. Women have made some important but still highly exceptional inroads professionally by that time. It was very much the old boys networks that were still defining accepted processes for hiring and public appointments. Perforce, women's advancement in academic and public arenas relied very much on their ability to connect to and acquire support from these traditional male networks. The importance of a wide network of strong political support is something for which Dr. Marsden seems to have that innate sociologist's appreciation. From the perspective of an insider in the many centers of power in Canadian public life over these past 4 decades, she has gained, I well imagine, considerable appreciation for both significant advantages and the exclusive disadvantages of elite control. Dr. Marsden has worked tirelessly at once to advance women in these positions of influence and to dismantle the most formidable of barriers confronting us still. In the tradition of the true organic intellectual, Dr. Marsden lives what she researches and researches what she lives. Her academic research has focused on social change in Canada, and her contributions to research, to university administration, and to public service have focused on shaping the very change she studies. Shortly after joining University of Toronto as a junior professor, she assumed the role of president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women in 1975, 4 short years after its inception, with a mandate to address matters such as daycare, birth control, maternity leave, family law, education, and pensions. 9 years later, in 1984, she was appointed by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau to the Senate of Canada, where she served for 8.5 years, before resigning to become president of Wilfrid Laurier University. While in Senate, she was vice chair of the Canadian Europe Parliamentary Association and chaired the Senate Committee on Social Affairs. Fast forward 20 years, 20 short years, Dr. Marsden has been awarded, here's the list, and this is only a partial list: the Order of Canada, the Order of Merit First Class in the Federal Republic of Germany, the Order of Ontario, the YWCA Women of Distinction Award, and was named one of Canada's 100 most powerful women each year from 2003 to 2007. She received the Golden Apple Award of the Federal Women Teachers Association of Ontario. She has been honored with the Queen's Silver and the Queen's Gold Jubilee Medals, the Canada 125 Anniversary Medal, the Arbor Award of the University of Toronto Alumni Association, and the Distinguished Alumni Award of the University of Victoria. And her contributions have not gone unnoticed by her primary profession, where she has received to date honorary degrees from 6 Canadian universities. She is currently a trustee of the Gardner Museum and of Roy Thompson Massey Hall Corporation. She has sat on the senior advisory panel to the Auditor General of Canada since 1996. She has sat as director or advisor on several private sector and public sector boards and institutes, including Manulife Financial, Gore Mutual, SNC Lavalin, West Coast Energy, Canada World Youth, the Conference Board of Canada, the Advisory Board, Green College UBC, Center for Development and Population Activities, and that's in Washington, D.C., and she was in the founding group of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. In her work to advance women in research, she has chaired the expert panel on women in university research for the Council of Canadian Academies. Dr. Marsden, then, is no stranger to the struggle for gender equality on several fronts. And as anyone who has confronted hegemonic dominance knows, in the struggle for equality, the emphasis is all too often on that word struggle. And too often it is a struggle about what next steps should be taken with the very people who share that same goal. Her most recent book, Canadian Women and the Struggle for Equality, which is available, thanks very much to Mike, and the York University Bookstore, from Oxford University Press, is highly readable narrative of some of this important history. Here to talk to us more about the struggle and her insights and contributions to advancing gender equality for Canadian women, I am so pleased to invite Dr. Marsden to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brenda. That's most generous, I must say. I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak on this day, which would have been International Women's Day, and it's very appropriate that it was postponed due to a strike, because it was women strikers who got the day going in many parts of the world. But I'm very pleased to be here today, and also pleased that the United Nations in 1975 made this a more universal day. It had been rather owned in the communist countries or parts of the world, but now we have a day to celebrate in which we avoid all the divisions of political ideology and religion and region and nationalism and ethnicity and all those sorts of things that can divide groups, and it becomes a world-building occasion. And as I hope you all know, many York people have been involved with the United Nations, and many now, I'm sure, sit on committees. But the first principal of Glendon College, where I now have my office, was Escott Reed. He was at the founding meetings of the United Nations, or the meeting in San Francisco. And if you'll forgive me, it's a wonderful memoir, by the way, for anybody interested in public policy. Let me just read you a short passage, because it comes up again in what I want to say. He says that one of his principal duties at the Canadian Embassy in Washington in 1944 and 45 was to help Lester Pearson, not yet Prime Minister Pearson, Foreign Secretary of State Lester Pearson, in his discussion with the State Department on the proposed United Nations organization. And the high point in this period was our reporting on the Dumbarton Oaks Conference from 21 August to 28 September 1944, at which the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union produced the Dumbarton Oaks Charter of the United Nations, a charter which was adopted by the San Francisco Conference 9 months later with relatively few substantial changes. And then, and I will come back to this later, he quotes from a letter to his wife, Ruth. The conference is filled with dullness and discussion that only slowly gets anywhere. Making peace is like making war. It's 10 parts boredom and 1 part excitement. An experience with anybody who's been associated with the United Nations has had over and over again. Now, during my life, I've found it very useful, very helpful to see how much we have to learn by looking at what women in other parts of the world are doing. So today, I want to talk to you about how this life in which I was able to observe other people finally led me to be interested in the subject that I cover in this book that the bookstore has kindly brought today. And I was particularly taken with this year's Canadian theme for International Women's Year, Make It Happen. And because this is the first of a series of slides, I really want to thank you, Lorraine. I'm hopeless at PowerPoint, and I'm not really very good at finding the pictures in the first place, and I've been rescued by Lorraine, so thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. Making it happen is the hardest challenge of all, improving the lives of women. We talk about making change, we have ideals, we have visions for what we'd like to see happen. We can analyze it, we can document it, but how do we actually make the change in the law or the change in services or the change actually happen? That is the very tough part. We're seeing it in our country right now in relation to the missing, murdered Aboriginal women. It's been around forever. It's been an issue for a long time. People are talking about it. It makes the front pages. But what has actually happened and what is going to happen? That is the very tough part that public policy people, for one, talk about. And there are several ways of going about this. One is to get the facts straight in a number of ways. Do I point it there? Good. So I want to bring to your attention this page called Women's Stats, and you can get it on the web, womensstats.org. This is a major research project at Brigham Young University. And what they do is look at all countries with a population of over 200,000, looking at 350 variables. So that makes it possible to look at comparative work. For example, one of their questions is women's security. And if you look at the beautiful graphics they do, infographics and maps and so on, you can see that compared to the United States, Canada's thought of as relatively more secure for women. But there are other areas in which Canada is not thought of as being ahead. So this is a very useful data set, and I look at it quite often, and I certainly urge you to have a look if you're interested in doing comparative work. But this afternoon I have a far more personal, sort of autobiographical story to tell. Some people become experts in international development and others in internationally useful occupations, healthcare workers and so on. But many of us are not expert. And it was what I observed in my travels in various countries where I saw women facing what seemed to me to be insuperable barriers to equality in any of life's dimensions. And in many cases saw those women survive and even thrive. That led me to ask the question, well, how do we actually make change in Canada? There are so many areas of inequality. There are maybe a few fewer than there were in 1971 when I got involved, but there are still so many areas in which there is nothing even approaching equality for women. I had the very good fortune as a high school student and then as a university student to travel. For example, in high school, in the late 1950s, I stayed with a family in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, a valley that had been bombed to nothing by the Allies during the war because it was the big industrial center of Germany. The father in this family was a coal miner, and the wife spent all day, every day, trying to make life go on, to find enough food. To heat hot water, it had to be by burning coal. All the things of daily life. It was a real shock to a teenager from Canada who, while we hadn't lived in prosperity, we certainly had never seen anything like that. It opened my eyes to a great many things. And later on that same trip, I went with a group of students on a third-class train trip through the former Yugoslavia to Greece, where unemployment as a result of the post-war civil war in Greece and their very depressed economy was very frightening to observe. You could see in the cafes, men would buy one little cup of coffee and they were still sitting with that cold cup of coffee after hours and hours. And the women were just not there to be seen at all. And it was quite obvious to us. And later on, as a graduate student, I had spent quite a lot of time looking at demographic data and become very interested in the questions of fertility and maternal health and so on. But there wasn't much going on in my grad school, so I went to Ethiopia for several months in the highlands. We have somebody from Ethiopia here today who knows all about this. But in 71, 72, when I was there, it was quite obvious what dreadful conditions things were in. People with advanced syphilis, people with leprosy, and with all the other diseases of poverty, bilharzia, a myriad of eye diseases affecting very young children up to old people. It was, and really worst of all, was to see women lying outside the hospital in Addis. There was then a sort of hillside because they couldn't get care and they had damage from breech births or other kinds of complications of giving birth. And they were just sort of lying there. It is the kind of thing that makes you say, what on earth can we do? What can we do to help? And by the way, and Haile Selassie was still around, and one Sunday I saw him literally throwing bread from his limousine as he paraded through the streets. It was an extraordinary time. It is, I hasten to add, a most beautiful country with the most beautiful people, the most interesting culture and languages. And I know that things have changed dramatically. But those were very, very bad times in Ethiopia, and learned a lot. And then I went down through all those little countries on the west coast of Africa, from Dakar to Lagos several times, and finally in the mid-70s up to the northwest province of Pakistan, which is now a very controversial area. But it was a chance to observe in many parts of the world the lives of women, to see how great the need was. And despite the many aid organizations and workers, in fact, I'd gone to see two people working on maternal health in a part of Pakistan, and unfortunately they'd been killed by local people who objected to birth control. The week before I got there, I didn't know this when I arrived, so needless to say, it was a terrible shock. But even with all this aid and all these people committed to doing good things, it's a drop in the ocean. And I found it really quite discouraging. But then I was lucky enough to be asked to work as a volunteer with a few organizations that provided a totally different view of how change can be made. And I offer you three cases this afternoon of international change. In 1984, I led the Canadian delegation to the World Population Conference in Mexico City. President Reagan had just declared that there was to be no U.S. aid money used for family planning where there might be any question of abortion. And so I met with a group of women on the sidelines of that conference to figure out how to get around this problem, and met a marvelous woman, the late Peggy Curlin of SEDPA. She'd spent much of her life in Bangladesh working on maternal health issues. And I was asked to join the board of this organization called SEDPA, which was referred to earlier, and its website is sedpa.org if you are, and it stands for the Center for Education and Development and Population Activities. What that organization does is bring women from countries where US aid or Canadian aid or Swedish aid is helping in projects of family planning and maternal health. It brings them to somewhere like Washington, and there they learn how you can manage a grant, how you can be sure your grant gets renewed, how you deal with accountants. And I don't have to tell anybody who works in a university how much work goes into getting grants, maintaining grants, filing the right papers on the right time. And this is what they do for these rather amazing women. If you go on their website, you'll see where they work now. Then they were working when I was on the board in Nepal and in Ghana and in various parts of Central America. And so these were extraordinarily interesting people, both the other board members, some from around the world, and the women who came to these 6-week training programs when we had a chance to talk to them. The women who came to the training programs, of course, got a lot of comparative information. They made international networks. And for the directors, it was very interesting. The woman from Ghana, who I met many times, was running a center somewhere outside Accra where they were trying to help women who wanted birth control. And there was huge hostility, and the army, invaded their offices and threw things around and so on, until this very clever woman did something that was really amazing. She persuaded the head of the military in her district that so many of his soldiers were suffering from sexually transmitted infections that the only possible solution was condoms. And she won him over. So this man who'd been her enemy and doing dreadful things, she turned into an ally. And of course, that was very helpful to the women, but it also, because she never said it was for birth control. It was only for health protection. Those keywords, I mean, those are sort of like the way you had to talk to President Reagan, right? Never for birth control, just for your health. She was a very, very clever woman. And it was this kind of thing that I thought was very interesting. Now, if you go on the SEDPA website, you'll find recent studies of similar problems in Ghana, especially with young girls, and what is being done about it. Then the board visited our projects in Guatemala. Oh, wrong way, sorry. And this is a group of women we met with in upcountry in Guatemala who are all midwives. And these were really wonderful women because it was traditional, it is traditional to have your birth with a midwife. And they were very successful at that. The infant mortality rate was down low, but at the same time, they understood the need for birth control and women's maternal health. And so they didn't let it be known except to the women. Guatemala was recovering from the Civil War. A lot of the women they worked with were just back from the refugee camps in Mexico. We met a lot of those women. There was a huge tension in the country. We kept going past these mass graves and places where so many people had been killed. But these were really remarkable women. They just cheerfully got on with it. They fit right into the population. Nobody thought they were extraordinary. Foreign aid workers wouldn't have had a chance. But supporting them, some of them had come to the programs in Washington, providing support really worked well with them. And now I want to show you another picture of the midwives, but do you recognize the woman at the back? That's Phoebe Asiyu from Kenya. She was a board member. She has an honorary degree from York University in 2003, and then our then Dean of Education, Paul Axelrod, took his family to visit her and her projects in Western Kenya. She's really an extraordinary woman. She's been on their Constitutional Reform Committee in Parliament and so on. She's still very much a factor. So SEDPA was making change, it still is, through education and training. But the key message here, it was that it was only the women with the local knowledge who were part of the local environment who could actually make the change. It certainly wasn't foreign aid workers. It certainly wasn't anybody who just sort of came in. That was a very important experience to see that work. Then President H.W. Bush came to power. He canceled all funding having anything to do with birth control and family planning. So if you wanted to continue to sit on the board of SEDPA, you had to be prepared to give about $50,000 a year US. And if you were Canadian or a foreigner, you didn't get a tax receipt either. So most of us left the board who were not in a position to do that. But I do have to say, we had great support from some key American women, one of them being Ann Richards, who has been the governor of Texas. Sadly, she's died, but she was really wonderful. She was a great character. And Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was extremely supportive when they were in the White House. She had us for lunch and met young people who were working in the field and so on, and the Clintons were very helpful with funding. But I'm afraid the Bush presidency changed for, of course, political reasons. And here you learn a different message, and that's the need for continuity. These projects these changes take a long time to happen everywhere, including Canada. It takes a long time. And there you need continuity. When US policy changed for domestic political reasons, people on the other side of the world felt the consequences with a lack of funding. And so SEDPA, of course, turned to Canada, to Sweden, to other countries to see if they could get funding. And some of you will have seen the story about the doctor from Ghana now at Sick Kids Hospital who has started a training program for maternity nurses. And obviously, he's getting his story out into the newspaper because he wants his grants renewed and to continue with the program. Continuity is really, really important. A second case study. An organization called the International Federation of Institutes for Advanced Studies, which had its headquarters at that point in Canada. And this is about women in science and technology. Here are some of the people who were involved. Our own professor, Bonnie Cattell, who was in the Faculty of Environmental Studies, was part of this group. Kamalini Bansali, who was the president of SNDT Women's University in India. Guilan Dong, who is a chief scientist in the government of the People's Republic of China. Nancy Lewis, a geographer from the East-West Center. Sheva Spindel, an economist from Brazil. Ravimbo Chimedza, an entomologist from Zimbabwe. Mali Sawana Adth, who is an environmentalist from Thailand. Farkhonda Hassan, a geologist from Egypt. And a graduate student at York University who completed her PhD in environmental studies not so long ago, lives just up the road, and still works in these fields of gender, science, and development. Her name is Sophia Heyer. And the purpose of this group was quite different from SEDPA. It was for networking and policy focus, inserting women's concerns and gender issues into the science and technology agendas around the world, partly through UN agencies. We found a marvelous woman whose work you may have read in development named Marilyn Carr, who was then working for UNIFEM in New York. And we held meetings and workshops with women science and technologists in Bangkok, Nairobi, Cairo, at the UN, and we wrote a whole series of papers on what we call safe womanhood, meaning women's health. Trade, we were interventionists in the Mercosur trade agreement in Latin America. But it was really hard getting into the Central and Latin American groups because I have to tell you, every committee was composed of men in blue suits. And when you went to try and make a presentation to them, they'd say, you can only come if you're pretty. And it was quite offensive. So what were we going to do? Well, Marilyn had graduated from the University of Sussex, and she knew a man who many of you will have known because he worked in Canada for a long time named Jeff Oldham. He was a professor there. And he was a quick study. We got him to come to the UN. We briefed him over breakfast. He went into one of these blue suit meetings, and he came out with the answer that 2 people from our group could go and sit on their committee on gender science and technology in Latin America. So Sheva Spindel, who's an economist from Brazil, and Ravimbo Chimedza, who's an entomologist, went and devoted hours and days and really had some impact. Not revolutionary impact, but they really did have some impact, and they had credibility. Every woman on this committee had a doctorate, they'd published in their field. And the work is still going on, although this group has dissolved, through TWOS, Third World Organization of Women in Science, AAAS, the Once and Future Project, and a whole series of other organizations which have grown up around that. Now, the key lessons there were, of course, you have to get through the door, you have to get into the decision-making meetings, and to do that, you have to call on men who are allies, because you're not going to get there by battering down the door. You need a man in a blue suit, if at all possible. It was a bit hard for Jeff. He wasn't used to wearing blue suits, but he did it. And that was a very important lesson in this country as well. Finally, third case history. I said I led the Canadian delegation to the World Population Conference in Mexico, and then I was asked, as a result of that, to join an advisory group for the UNFPA, Fund for Population Activities, for several years. Now, my experience were very much like Escott Reed's. We prepared for international meetings. We worried about words, a whole word, would take a whole day to insert it into the declaration. We worried about process. And when this next world population came up in Cairo in 1994, I went to that meeting. It was an extraordinary meeting. And through this whole process, I learned to have enormous respect for diplomats, for public servants who spend their lives fighting for the right wording that will satisfy the big powers and serve the small powers. Unless you are an expert, unless you've chosen this, it is unbelievably tedious work. But I don't want to discourage any of you who are going into this area. It's very important work. Things happen as a result of it. And it really was quite something. At that conference, the Vatican and the leader of one of the largest Muslim groups made common cause against birth control. And working around that, finding words that they would eventually agree to, was really quite something. But something else happened at the UNFPA. We held a conference, a forum on population in the Netherlands. Please look at the date. Does any of you know what happened on the 9th of November, 1989? The wall came down in Berlin. And I have to say, the UN was very disappointed at how few people were in the meetings. We were all watching this incredible change as people poured over the wall. It was, and to be so close to it in real time in Amsterdam was really quite something in 1989. So, you know, I said it was really tedious, but there were really exciting moments in those years. So what was learned? What did I learn anyway? I learned how crucial local knowledge is and how pointless it is for outsiders to really try to make the kind of change that lasts and that is needed. How networks get ideas across if you can get into the decision-making room. How the rules of governance and procedure can have a very important impact internationally. So I began to think about, well, how did we make changes in this country? How does it work here? What was the local knowledge? And that's what this book, Canadian Women, the Struggle for Equality, is attempting to understand. Now, of course, I've been involved, as you heard in Brenda's remarks, in the women's movement here for a long time, and the National Action Committee and the Ontario Committee on the Status of Women, in which I was and still am involved, set out to make effective the recommendations of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. So we were largely interested in legislative change and regulatory change. But I never really asked the question, what's different about how we do it in Canada? And so that's what I was trying to figure out. We have some barriers in this country that are particular in the way they operate to this country. For example, in the federal provincial division of power settled at the time of Confederation in 1867, most of the issues we want to have changed are at the provincial level. And they're not the same across the country. Healthcare isn't the same across the country. Unemployment insurance, child custody varies across the country. Division of property varies across the country. And so the task, if you want to make change in this country, is to have to work in every single jurisdiction, the provinces and the territories. Education is different, health, you know, almost all aspects of our life. It may be good in some ways, but it's a real barrier to getting change done, especially if the feds don't set up national standards that you can go after. So I want to talk this afternoon about 3 of the case studies where women were really effective and change was made. Now, there are lots of women's organizations in this country from the very beginning. Obviously, there were church and religious organizations. The temperance organizations, which were in favor of women's rights and suffrage, were founded in 1874. There were unions, trade unions, and they were very active, and they did an enormous amount of work, and they still are, and there's still a lot to be done. There was the YWCA, which was founded in Canada in 1870, the National Council of Women, an amazing national organization, founded in 1893. By the way, it had its constitution written by Borno, Borono, who has written the rules of procedure for Parliament, and he followed that model in his Constitution for the National Council of Women. Very interesting story. Women's University Club started in Ontario in 1903, and the Federation of University Women's Clubs in 1919, largely from Vancouver. The Business and Professional Women, it goes on and on and on. Big organizations. Many of you are members, I trust, or will be members. They're very important. They look at important issues. They write position papers. The National Council of Women has a meeting with the federal cabinet every year to press concerns, and they have done since whenever it was, 1896 or something. So there are lobbies and there are voices across the country. But having said that, the vast majority of people of both sexes in this country pay no attention whatsoever to equality rights for women. And when you're working on them, you can think it is a big issue. But largely, it is not. Another major feature of Canada, compared to elsewhere, is how reasonable and helpful Canadian men can be. There isn't a culture in this country of men opposing women. There are men who oppose women. But it's not deeply embedded in the culture. The Canadian military would have no right to come and break up your stall if you were talking about contraceptives at a conference. That hasn't happened. Most of them didn't think about it either. My favorite example is a man about whom I've been able to find out nothing else besides I've harassed one or two of the historians in the room, see if they can help. This is a man who came to the Ontario legislature before women got the vote. His name was John Waters. He was from somewhere down in Middlesex County. He was in the legislature for 11 years. Every single year he put in a bill to give women the vote. Never got past first reading. And then he resigned. And I don't know anything, I can't find out anything else about this amazing man. Who was he? Why did he do that? He didn't do anything else in the legislature. There's a legislative record on him, but there's nothing else. So I hope some bright student is going to, who's better at the archives than I am, is going to dig into Mr. Waters and find out who he is. He should at least be in the Canadian Dictionary of Biography. The struggle for suffrage was long. In this province where we live, there were 18 bills for suffrage before we got anywhere. And of course, since there were no women in the legislature, by definition, all those bills were brought in by men. So let's look first at the case of suffrage. How did women get it? I'm sure you're all familiar with the basic story here, and I don't intend to go over it all. But to try and point out what might be a little bit different, you know that there was a lot of agitation for women's suffrage, and you've probably read Catherine Cleaverden's book or Canadian Women, A History in the new edition. There were focused groups of women, but they were relatively small and they weren't making much headway. The speakers from the US, all the great British, the Pankhursts and everybody came and spoke at Massey Hall. There was terrific response, but still nothing much happened. But Canadian women used the rather brilliant strategy of mockery. The first mock parliament was held in Ontario in 1896. And these were sort of plays in which they'd make fun of the premier and the legislators, and they were a big hit. They were a big public draw. Everybody would go to see them. And it caught the attention of women journalists, among others. And these women journalists were really important, and so were the mock parliaments. So here is the poster for the mock parliament of 1914 in Winnipeg at the Walker Theatre. And the premier was Duff Roblin. And Duff Roblin suffered from pomposity. He also suffered from the fact that he was unpopular and his government was on its sort of last cycle. And Nellie McClung, there she is, played the part of Duff Roblin. She dressed sort of like a man. She sort of tried to walk like him, and she made fun of him, and people loved it. And the people who loved it were the journalists and the Grain Growers Association. They thought this was absolutely terrific. So when we get around to the government was thrown out, the new government came in, they proposed a bill for suffrage, it was now widely known about. It was widely supported. The new government didn't want to suffer the fate that Duff Roblin and his government had suffered. So they quickly put in a bill to give women the vote in Manitoba. Fortunately, the night before he was to speak, the leader of this new party, the Liberal Party in Manitoba, his wife happened to see the bill, which he'd left carelessly at home when he went off to make a speech, and realized that the bill would give women the vote but not the right to stand for public office. So she phoned her sister, who was a journalist covering the convention of grain growers at which he was to speak, and her sister made a great big fuss, and they changed the legislation. So in 1917, women in Manitoba and then Saskatchewan and Alberta all got the right to vote. Sorry, 1916. In 1917, the women in BC got the vote and the right to stand for public office. In this province, women got the right to vote, but not to stand for public office until 2 years later, and so on and on it went. And then in 1918, the women in Nova Scotia got the right to vote, but of course they'd had the right to vote up until 1851, when the governments of Lower and Upper Canada had taken away women's right to vote, and in Nova Scotia and so on. So it's an interesting story. But my point here is that something that really worked to tip things over the edge was mockery, was humor, because by and large, it's okay to laugh at people, and we like to laugh at people in this country, especially people we think aren't doing very well. And it was a very effective weapon. But to get the vote federally, it was a different circumstance. We were in the middle of World War I. We had to get, the government wanted to get a conscription bill through to be able to recruit more people. And to do that, they offered the vote to the wives, daughters, sisters of men who were serving overseas, 1917. And then, of course, that led to 1918 pressure on the government to give the vote to all women, and then eventually, by 1921, Canadian women had the right to vote and to stand for public policy, for public office federally, and in every province except Quebec, where they didn't get the right to vote until 1940. So humor, government having a big need for some kind of support, and the fact that women were ready. Women's organizations and their allies were ready. They had written the script. They were ready to go in. That was, I think, the key in this country, as it was if you compare it to how they got suffrage in Britain or elsewhere. Second case, the Persons case, 1929. You probably all know about the Persons case. This was a totally different strategy. This was a mobilization of elites for a purpose not widely understood. The Senate was no more popular then than it is now. And the really great detailed description is to be found in this book by Robert Sharp and Patricia McMahon, and I really recommend it. It's the Osgood series of studies. Because what happened here was that Emily Murphy, on your right, was really wanted to be a senator. She was a magistrate in Alberta, but she wanted to be a senator. And of course, women weren't allowed to be senators because the Supreme Court of Canada said women were not persons. They were persons in, I've forgotten the language, somebody here probably knows that they were persons in pain and suffering, but not in the right to be in the Senate, which is appointed. They were allowed to stand for elected office, but they weren't allowed to be candidates for appointed office. Her strategy is what is interesting. Now, we don't have an elite structure in Canada similar to that which is found in many other countries. We don't have a royal something at the top and massive landowners and that sort of thing, and especially didn't in those days. And so there's no exclusive elite structure, but it just happened that Emily Murphy knew, even though she was a conservative, she knew Mackenzie King, the Liberal Prime Minister, and she knew members of the Supreme Court, and her brother was a constitutional lawyer and so on. So she worked her way through all of these things. She got the support, this is the famous five, she got the support of the other women, Nellie McClung, Henrietta Edwards, who am I missing here? Anyway, you can read about these people, there's a statue to them on Parliament Hill. She'd get them to write letters at key points, but she was really the driving force, using who she knew, in what positions of power, until finally she worked it so that Supreme Court decisions could be appealed to the Privy Council in Britain, and she got that to happen, and Nelson Rowell was the lawyer who took the case before the people in Britain. The Nellie Library here, the Women's Studies Library, is named after Nelson Rowell, whose granddaughter and Senator Nancy Ruth funded the library here. And it won. It's an interesting, complicated story. It changed the nature of Supreme Court decisions. It's got an awful lot. If any of you are in law or going into law, it's a really, really interesting story. But the lesson here is, this was an equality right that nobody really gave a darn about, but except these five women. And they won it. And they just did it. They didn't bother mobilizing a great social movement. They had allies, but they were really working channels that would get them there where they needed to go. Not popular, but an important right one. Third case, you know this one even better, patriation of our Constitution and the Charter. Now, I might ask you, how many of you, well, many of you maybe weren't around in the early 80s, but how many people among those of us who are slightly older understood what was the importance of patriation and the Charter? You scholars in the room, you'd have known that this would make it possible for amendments to our Constitution to be made here, instead of having to go to Great Britain. You knew that that was of real importance and symbolic importance. And probably you may have understood why the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms was going to be important, but most people didn't have a clue, except people who understood constitutional history and constitutional law. Now, for women, getting into the Charter, Section 15 on equality rights and Section 28, notwithstanding clause, sort of belt and suspenders for women's rights and other people's rights, has had a very major impact. But it had to be explained to it. Doris Anderson was then the chair of the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and when Mary Eberts, one of these great constitutional thinkers, said to Doris, this Constitution that's coming is going to be important, Doris said, why is the Constitution important for women's rights? She didn't understand at all. None of us who aren't lawyers understood that issue. And it had to be explained to us. All the way across the country, it had to be explained to us. And there's great legal minds like Mary Eberts and Beth Atchison and Marilyn McPhedra and all of them from Ontario, and similar women elsewhere did that. But there's something very lucky that happened. Just luck. There's a gender ratio in here, something that really hadn't happened very much before. You can see three women sitting, it's not the latest Supreme Court, but you can see three women, including the Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin, 4 women, right? Yeah, a moment in time, 4 out of 9 on the Supreme Court. But look at this, just before this happened, women started going to university in this country in large numbers in the 1970s. Before that, it had been relatively small number of women, and mostly in certain fields. But they started going to university. So here we are about 10 years later. This is a case of change through sheer numbers. So you see that in 1931, there were 8,000 lawyers and notaries in Canada, and I think maybe 2% were women. And in 86, there was 43,000. This is a growth sector. That's why Osgoode Hall is so filled. But when you look at women lawyers and notaries in Canada, in 1931, there were 54. In 1929, there were, in 1941, there were 129. It went to 309. And in 1986, it went up to, I've lost the number, but thousands. So there were women, young women, pouring out of law schools. Now, they may not have understood all the implications of the Charter and the Constitution, but it was so easy to explain it to them. So you had seminars going on at Osgoode Hall and all the law schools across the country. And the difference was this. So when the rest of us in the women's movement learned about this, even though we didn't really understand all the details of it, it was everywhere in the country. Suddenly there was an audience, there were a number of voices. And if you talk to members of parliament at that time, from both in the government and in the opposition, they will tell you that they heard about this in their writings because the B's and P's and the Council of Women and the University Women and the people in the social service groups had heard just enough to know that this was important. And there's a paper about to be published in Atlantis, which is a women's studies publication, now online. It hasn't quite come out yet. But it details, in ways that we haven't seen before, some of this behind-the-scenes discussion that occurred around these issues. But I think that it would not have happened. We would not have won, certainly 28, and probably not 15 in its language, if there hadn't been this enormous increase in the number of women in the field of law who understood and took on board those kinds of ideas. So it isn't a majority of lawyers. It's not all lawyers agree, of course, by definition. They are trained not to agree with anybody. If you have them in your family, you know that. But there were enough of them to lead the charge for entrenchment and then, of course, to establish LEAF, the Legal Education Action Fund, which you all know about, which was established as this was happening to fight cases as they came before the courts. That's what they do. They take a lot of cases for Aboriginal women. They've taken cases about denial of maternity benefits. They don't win them all, but they raise a lot of consciousness all. So, to conclude, it seems to me that we learn a lot by looking at what's going on elsewhere in the world. We have to know what's going on locally. We have to know what the people are. We have to know about rules and governance. We have to be prepared with our arguments when the opportunity arises, as it did for women getting the vote federally in the First World War. But in this country, we have to always remember that we're dealing with a federal system with all kinds of, somebody said in the Globe this morning, bristling with barriers between the provinces and all sorts of areas where it's very hard to make change. We have to overcome our geography. We have to be able to work in both our languages. We have to build groups and networks. And we have to have people who are prepared, specialists, people on the inside. Always good to know deputy ministers, ADMs, public servants. We have to have experts who will explain to people who don't understand the issue what the issue is about and why it has to go through this way if you want the change to actually happen. And we have to have people who communicate. We have to have journalists. We have to have people who make films and write essays and write stories knowledgeably, accurately, and they're very, very important. And we have to seize the day. In fact, if you want to make change for women, as I think every example I've talked about and others I've seen, you really have to be opportunistic. You have to sit there and watch, and when the moment is right, it's very hard to create the moment, but when the moment is right, you have to get it done. So thank you very much for listening. And thank you very much, those of you who have or are going to read this book and see if you can find the ways in which things change.
Thank you very much, Lorna. I understand you will respond to some questions. There are 2 microphones, one on either side of the room, and you will have noticed that the proceedings are being filmed, and we won't hear your question if you don't speak it into a microphone. So please make your way to one or other microphones, and while people are doing that, I just want to react to your emphasis on your title, make it happen, and the importance of actually doing things rather than just having good ideas. It may be, if this is even a word, religious-centric of me, but how many people here can quickly think of the 5th book of the New Testament of the Bible? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. It's not the plans or the visions of the apostles, it's the acts of the apostles. It really is important to do things. Oh, sorry, I thought you were heading to a microphone. Is there anyone who has any questions they would like to ask? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That was wonderful. When I was reviewing the original mandate of the National Action Committee for the Status of Women, I was noticing that daycare was then an issue, and certainly in our experience for a lot of students who are primary caregivers, it's still a major issue. So I was wondering if you might share some thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. I sure would. In the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, those commissioners, quite extraordinary people, mostly women, argued that until we have both childcare and daycare for other age groups, we really don't have full access to economic life for men and women, but mostly it is women who end up in the caregiving role. We've not made much progress on that at all. Even in Quebec, which probably has the best policy, it's provincial policy, or sometimes municipal policy, even there where it's very low cost, and there is quite a bit of it, I'm told by friends in Quebec that if you don't live in Montreal or Quebec City or some large town, it is not by any means universal, and there are various complaints. There are other issues like that. Equal pay. We've been working on equal pay for years. We're nowhere near equal pay. Some employers are better than others. It's mandated. The employment equity, the Royal Commission on Employment Equity that Judge Rosalie Abella did, is an independent, brought in employment equity and for opportunities in the labor market. But I deliberately didn't talk about those things today. They're not gains. They're nudging forward. But we are nowhere really there, and in some countries they are. So, there are particular barriers. We don't have a very dense population in many parts of this country. The feds in the province can never seem to get their act together. There have been various promises for national daycare programs. It will happen at some point, but we have a lot of miles to go, I'm afraid, before we're going to get solve this problem.
What do you think the barriers are?
Well, I think the barriers are cost, and where have there been some successes? In some school boards, where they have overcome the issues. In some services, if you have parental care needs, now you can get them in some parts of the city, but not elsewhere. So it's going to take some very dramatic action, I think, before we get anything that is a comprehensive program in those areas. Sorry to say.
This Simone Bon from Political Science. It was wonderful to hear from you. I mean, it's such a compelling, detailed progression through history. And for me, particularly, it's very interesting because it's a very different context from the one that I research, which is South America, particularly Brazil. And I guess my question is, because of this background of mine, if you look at the countries of South America, you're going to see that obviously the struggles that you talk about are equally important and valid. But when we look at the regional diversity of these countries and the huge divide between rural and urban parts, and etc., we see that the struggle for raising women to the level of rights that men have, it's as important as dealing with the gaps across women, across groups of women. So that is, if you look at certain groups of women in South America, they have very important rights, and they have access to public policy that other groups of women are denied just because of their social background, their ethnic background, or where they are located. So, and in Canada, it's also a federation that's also very diverse. So I was just wondering, what role do this diversity also plays here in Canada? Because we know about, Canada, a bilingual country, and we have a large, Aboriginal population. So how much should we look for, I guess my question is, should we also be thinking about not only, men versus women, but also, looking at the women as a category and try to break it down and look at these diverse groups? So I guess this is my question to you.
And it's a very interesting question. And there is real leadership, obviously, of women in Brazil, as we all know, in a variety of areas. But this is where I think the focus on local knowledge becomes important. Of course it should be done. Of course we should be looking at all groups in the population here and there and seeing where we can gain equality or even improvements in people's lives. But you need to know the people. You need to know the laws. You need to know how the Constitution operates in order to really understand how to go about it. Why did women in the United States not get the ERA? Because under their Constitution, you have to get so many states, et cetera, a barrier we don't face in this country, or at least we didn't. And we'll see now after the constitutional amendments. But so I can't answer the question of Brazil, but I do think that human rights and freedoms should be universal. Access to them should be universal. I think that's an ideal that many people have held for a very long time in history. It's how you go about it. How do you get from here to there? That's the challenge. And you'll know an awful lot more than I know about what it is and how it has to happen in Brazil. I must say, do you know Sheva Spindel? She was an economist from Brazil who worked on the group I was talking about. She is a very sophisticated fighter for women's rights, very, very good, and also sits on the board of the MacArthur Foundation, which is an organization that can be very helpful in these issues. But one of the points I'm trying to make is that you really do have to know the terrain. You have to know who the people are, what they want, what they will agree with in order to make it happen.
Richard Fidd, University of Guelph. One of the problems in Canada, of course, is that, and this may not be well known, but there's very little knowledge about provincial organizations and ministries. We have quite a bit of knowledge on federal organizations, but for some strange reason, there's not much information available on provinces. I taught a course at Guelph for over 30 years. Most students will write on federal organizations, but they could not find information on provincial organizations. In many instances, because you've had single parties like in Ontario, dominating the situation for over 40 years, no demands were made in that society for more public information. And I suspect maybe the same problem in Alberta. So the question is, to have public policy, given the chronological knowledge that is required, people do not know enough to do that.
Well, that's very interesting. And I think it's true, but at the same time, for example, if the Ministry of, what's it called now? Social Services, I call it in Ontario. Community and Social Services. Used to have long lists of women's organizations because those were their consultative networks. But They'd know about the organizations in Lakehead or in Peterborough, but not necessarily what connected them all. After the Royal Commission on the Status of Women reported, some of the recommendations were at the provincial level and some at the federal level. At the provincial level, small groups, status of women groups, sprang up in all the provinces, as you probably know. And in Ontario, there were many, there were dozens. Most of them haven't survived, but it is also true that most of them then merged into whatever was the dominant local organization, whether it was the Y, it was often the Y, or the daycare coalitions, or some form. And so I'm always meeting people who used to be in status of women but are now chairing some committee environmentally, or people who are interested in social issues tend to stay interested in social issues and move around. And we used to have a women's bureau in the Ontario government that was very good and very helpful. If you look at some of the briefs from the OCSW, you will see they're printed on paper that was only available to provincial ministries, because we'd get our friends in there to do the photocopying because we couldn't afford it. And it was a telltale sign, if anybody had paid attention, that they were using metric paper and nobody else in the province was. So, that's what I mean by people on the inside. And they certainly knew the consultative groups. Now, whether they still do or not, I don't know, because thank goodness, most of the action has passed to younger women, and they will probably know the answers. I always think it's about women who are about 24 or 25 who've had the first difficult experience in the labor market or trying to find daycare. They're the ones who get involved because they've really felt it. But if that is the case, then we should put pressure on for networks to be established and reestablished. We've had a long, quiet period on women's rights in this province. Not a lot has happened. I think we're probably...
Hi, I'm a mature student, and I'm old enough to appreciate all the gains that women have made, and thanks to women like yourself. My question, I work in domestic violence, and I'm also doing research. My question is, do you think there's a discourse that says that women are equal, and is that a barrier to change for us?
It is a very good point. And yes, there is a discourse about it. And if you try to refute it, it sounds as though you're whining, right? No, it hasn't been resolved kind of argument. And I think that's where it's very useful to have the numbers and to have the facts and sort of keep them handy, especially on areas of domestic violence, where we are getting better police statistics than we used to have. I'm not as sophisticated as many other people are about this, but I've always found it was very useful to be able to cite the facts. Do you know how many people have been charged in this town in the last, whatever you can get, time period? Because that's a problem that never goes away. It's the problem of the 1700s in New Brunswick. There were big military garrisons, and the beating of wives or women was a huge problem when you read those kind of legal documents. It's around, it's a long problem, and the solutions are not perfect, but there is a more attentive policing response and so on than there used to be. And shelters, of course. In the 70s, shelters were the big issue. It's not a solution, but it's a little help to the women who've been involved. It's a very big problem. I wish you all the best with it. It's tough.
Hello, welcome once again. It's Yvonne Simpson from the Center for Human Rights. I'm a research assistant. I'm with the Department of Health Policy Management, Critical Disability Studies. So my interest is in looking at a diversity lens with respect to the treatment of women in Canada, Aboriginal women, immigrant women, and in particular, especially in terms of your work and representing the status of women, and this being the week that we're reflecting on the remembering injured workers. When William Meredith went on his sojourn in 1913 to create our WSIB policy, his intention, and after his 3-year journey, returned to Canada and wrote a policy that essentially reflected the needs of protecting men in the workforce. Women at the time were not contemplated, even though they had worked during all the wars to keep the country going. So we have shifted in terms of now having WSIB policy progress within its mandates and changes in legislation to recognize women. So we've gone from a men's compensation to workers' compensation. At the same time, the policy does not reflect the unique diversity that we now have in this country, where 70% of our workforce are represented by immigrant workers, majority of whom are women. A vast majority, based on our current policies, our immigration policies, are foreign workers who have no rights. And therefore, if we look at the lens of diversity, and for Aboriginal women in the country and immigrant women who are majority racialized and marginalized, what do we see in terms of the future and the status of women with respect to that context? And what can we do in terms of a justice framework in the works that we do in scholarship or as practitioners in advancing the rights of women and speaking about the status of women from a diversity lens?
That's another big issue. I think you actually have an opportunity at the moment. Liz Whitmer, who used to be a member of the provincial parliament, is now she's chairing the WSIB. And she's a person who would listen carefully to a case. She'd be a great speaker for International Women's Day, actually. And you might go and see her. Elizabeth Whitmer, she's from Waterloo, so I know her. Because you're right. First of all, the WSIB is funded, as you all know, by employers. And so if you are, for example, women who are injured in the household, it's really hard to get into that program, and there are so many domestic workers who don't have protection. So the expansion of protection, and of course the kinds of injuries that are looked at, soft tissue issues being the big one, but many others, would be a great opportunity. And I think that if people interested in that area wrote a brief with all the data, with the legal, I don't mean you need a lawyer, but pointing out what the law and what the regulations, which are on the web, do and don't do, so that it makes the case, I think you might get a very attentive ear there and really make some change, and that would be wonderful. You've got contingent workers who are not unionized, many of them, they're not getting that kind of protection. Huge number, especially among new populations, the newest populations in the country. And they need to be spoken for and with and so on. So I guess the point, and I think you're making this point as well, at least in my experience, no matter how angry one gets about the issue, that doesn't move change. So I've never seen any great change come out of demonstrations, for example. I mean, people pay attention. Sometimes you get a journalist who covers it. But it's an awful lot of effort for very little gain. It's far more effective to find the right person, the deputy or the member of the legislature or the body such as the WSIB, and make the case directly so that they are asked to consider it. Like the woman in Ghana, you have to bring those people on side. You have to turn them into allies, because the power to make the changes that we all want made doesn't lie with us. It lies with people who are in positions to make those kinds of changes. So I hope that you and your allies can make get those kinds of changes made. It's hard work, but it can be done. Good luck.
Thank you. Not seeing anyone else rush for the microphone, can I call on James Simeon to thank our speaker today?
Lorna Marsden, President Emerita, both at York University and Wilfrid Laurier University, two institutions of higher education that I've had a privilege of attending and graduating from. On behalf of all of those in attendance and the various sponsors of our postponed International Women's Day inspired ceremonies, please allow me to thank you for joining us as our special guest speaker. And I couldn't help but think, as you were presenting, this amazing personal history in terms of your experiences about women's struggle for equality, not only around the world, which I didn't know previously, but also here in Canada, that you, in fact, have helped make it happen in the various positions that you've had, both with the National Action Committee in Ottawa at a very critical time as well, being part of that and being leader for that, but also in the various positions that you've held. And you've broken many glass ceilings. There are very few people that have been president of a university once, but you've been president at two different universities, but in addition to that, also served in the Senate of Canada. So we're very privileged to have you here. I couldn't think of anyone more ideal to speak on International Women's Day and to talk about the women's struggle, not only here in Canada, but abroad. So thank you very much for being with us today. And as a token of our appreciation and a memento of this occasion, I'd like to present you with what has become, as the master of McLaughlin College would say, one of the most coveted, I guess, gifts that we offer not only at McLaughlin College, but also here at York University. It is the McLaughlin College mug. And the only way that you can actually get one of these mugs is if you have been a speaker at a McLaughlin College sponsored event. And it's worth noting that you have spoken now at one of the pinnacle events in terms of the ceremonies that we recognize here at York University in terms of our United Nations International Days. And International Women's Day, of course, perhaps being one of the foremost. I'd like to say as well that reflecting upon your comments has brought to mind the critical importance in terms of leadership. And it was women individually and collectively that came to the fore to move many of these things and to create these changes towards equality. And I'd like to not only thank you, but I hope that you will continue to stay actively involved, both as an educator, but also as an activist, and continue to shatter those glass ceilings in whatever field of endeavor, and continue to demonstrate your leadership in terms of the women's movement. So thank you so much, Lorna.
As we draw to a close, on behalf of men in blue suits, or at least men in blue blazers, I'd like to thank you all. There are copies of Lorna Marsden's book available for purchase from the bookstore there. Thank you, bookstore. And I know Lorna would be happy to sign any copies that any of you would wish to purchase and bring over to her. I also know she'd be happy to talk with any of you who want to follow up this discussion. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you over in McLaughlin College at our next event.